Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly podcast. I'm John Kelly, senior editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCampAudio on all major social media. On today's episode, we feature our conversation with Dave Newell, who last year was the CEO of the Children's Home Society of Washington. Now he is the CEO of Akin, which is the new organization created by the merger of his organization and another entity called Child Haven in Washington State. And as this new organization sets its sights on working mostly upstream of the child welfare system in the state, the last vestige of non-kinship foster care managed by Children's Home Society will soon be sunsetted. So I talked to Dave about the plans for the merger, how this came together, what will be substantively different about, the operation of this new organization as opposed to the sum of its parts. We got into a little bit of reflection on the last place that Dave worked. He was in Nebraska for quite an interesting time there with their privatization efforts. So I talked to him a little bit about that at the end. It's a great conversation overall. I'm going to apologize up front. I think that Christine, my wizardess, will probably get rid of a lot of the clicks, but I feel like there were some clicks in this interview. That's because I've had a dreadful chest whatever. And when I was interviewing Dave, I had to mute myself to cough a million times. So I apologize if any of those pop in. It's annoying. I know we strive for very high quality audio here. Two interesting things to listen for here that I thought were kind of interesting that popped out. One is really, just Dave Newell, the man, and his own journey as somebody who came, after a lengthy career in child welfare. His last stop was, as I mentioned, in Nebraska. He led Promise Ship, which is an organization that frankly managed foster care for a big portion of the state, and came here to Washington State to lead Children's Home Society and now Akin. He is a guy who really kind of fundamentally has given up on the idea of reforming, at least the front end of the system. And we get to that a little bit towards the end of this conversation, his views on really the sort of front end surveillance aspect of child welfare and why he thinks it's, he's kind of come to the conclusion that it's kind of irredeemable and needs to be just replaced. And then I think the second thing is that the view, you're going to hear him talk a lot about the view of the future under Akin. And obviously, as that name suggests, a big part of what they'll be doing is working on kinship care. And I think that that's an interesting, crossroads what they're coming to. There's a lot of policy in Washington State, some put forth by the state Supreme Court, then kind of codified by the legislature to really put kin first, in the continuum of the child welfare system there. But that's still, that is still a situation where you're talking about the removal of children. So Dave kind of explains his thinking on, the difference between getting out of foster care, as he says they are doing, while maintaining, an interest in playing a role in kinship care. Let's get to it here. Here's our conversation with Dave Newell of Akin. In December, Washington State was home to Child Haven, a nonprofit that has delivered community family services in the state since the early 1900s. Started as a nursery for single parents that needed childcare to earn a living. It was the first to bring Head Start to the West Coast. Washington was also home to the Children's Home Society of Washington. It's even older. It started in the 1890s. And they have played a role in really everything from community services to foster care and adoption. Effective this month, there is only Akin, the byproduct of a merger between these organizations that takes place amidst some significant policy changes in Washington State. Here to talk about the merger and more is Akin's new CEO, Dave Newell. Dave, welcome back to the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it.
So we got to give these guys a little bit of something about you, like we did last time. So I'm going to ask you for at least one of your favorites, movie, TV show, book, musical group or sports team. Last time I went back and looked, last time you gave me Big Bang Theory, so that's off the table. You got to give me something new. You give me more than one if you want, but you got to give me one. What do you got, Dave?
Okay, well, the one that I just finished watching their latest run this year is Fargo, the TV version of Fargo. So I was watching that last night, and I'm originally from South Dakota, so
Oh,
Fargo
nice.
Fargo really resonates with me. So that's what I was watching lately. So
Does the new season take place in South Dakota? I love that show, by the way. I loved every one of those seasons.
yeah,
So.
but goes all of them go back and forth
You're right.
between Minnesota and North Dakota. So, but
Got it.
South Dakota is pretty similar. So,
Should South Dakota and North Dakota merge now that you guys have merged? What do you think?
well, that's a political issue.
It sure
South
is.
Dakotans and North Dakotas have pretty strong feelings, so I'm not going to mess with them.
So, normally on this podcast, I don't think we would endeavor to discuss a merger of two providers in one state. But I do think Children's Home Society is a pretty significant player in child welfare across the country. And I know both of these organizations, so it did pique my interest. I came back from holiday over the Christmas vacation and saw that this had happened. The name interested me. So let's get right into it. What is the substantive way in which this new organization, Akin, is different than either of its parts, right? Like, what is different today in Washington for kids and families because you guys came together as opposed to just we're both providers?
Sure. So I don't know that I would say there's anything different right today, John, but I think it's where we're going. And here again, it's not a change of direction for either company, but what brought the two organizations together is, and of course, I know you're probably more familiar with CHSW, is for the last 30 years, both organizations were really on this trajectory of moving upstream and moving away from traditional child welfare services and really focusing on child well-being. And so both organizations had that in common for the last 30 years, and that's part of what made this merger possible. And then as far as what I think what I'll frame it as what will be different
That's a good
is
way
that as the two organizations are coming together, Akin is really solidifying the direction that we both were going. And we are really going to be focusing on child and family well-being. And that is where the combined force, we are going to continue our efforts in national and local advocacy around child and family well-being. And I think as we build this new organization, that's what's going to be really transformative. And just as an example of what I mean by that is we're in the process of winding down our last foster care program, which is currently very small. And that will be wound down probably by about June. And when that happens, we are going to be 100% in the early intervention, prevention, child and family well-being space. And as you know, a lot of organizations with similar histories are still very much in that space, and we are moving 100% out of it.
What is it? I'm curious. I was aware that was happening. It sounds like that was happening regardless. Like if you had not
Yes,
merged,
yeah, that was the direction we were headed. Yes.
down. What has been the reaction? I wonder from the Child Welfare Agency there, because I think that they are certainly working on policies that more prioritize right for like kinship caregivers in the system and prevention themselves. But it still stinks to lose a very reputable provider that's doing foster care for you. So, I mean, how did they take that news whenever you rolled it out? Have they given you guys input on this merger?
In Washington State, it's called DCYF is what it's called here. And they continue to be a partner with us because I think John, too, DCYF several years ago in Washington State reorganized itself in large part to your point of really wanting to go with the child well-being direction. But they still are clearly a traditional child protection agency.
Sure.
So as have been working with the department, we have a good partnership with them. I think to your point, there was a bit of an ambivalence. Would they like us to stay in that space? I don't want to represent for them, but I think they would say yes. So I'm not speaking for the department. But at the same time, we actually got an extremely positive response from DCYF and their leadership because they know too that by focusing, going upstream and really focusing on child and family well-being, that ultimately that's going to decrease the need for child protection in Washington state. So they are actually very excited about this merger and want to partner with us because they see the potential of us being an important partner for them.
Gotcha. So, I mean, I hear the name, and obviously the first thing that I lead to is kinship care and kin, as in, family and close friends. Can you talk a little bit, though, about sort of how you guys arrived at that name? And I think within that, how this new organization views kinship care in the context of what we were just talking about. I mean, obviously, kinship care can still mean out of home removals.
Yes, it can.
So is that fair game for what you guys see as your future, or is that something, that you guys intend to play a role in or not?
We intend to still stay very active in advocacy around things that might be perceived as traditional child welfare or child protection. And we absolutely support kinship care, which, as you know, can look differently depending on what's going on with the child or family. And so philosophically, we're absolutely in support of that. And there could be a role that we could play as far as that goes. And kind of related to that is you know, with kinship care, it's not defined by law necessarily or by blood. And so, we think people should define who their family is. We shouldn't define that for them. And so who I call my family and who you call the family might be different. And you're the one who decides who your family is and how you want to be supported.
So in announcing this, you guys jointly put out a statement, and I want to read one part of that statement and ask you to kind of maybe expand on it a little. Each organization focused on expanding resources with good intentions and acknowledges their historical approach has had unintended consequences with a disproportionately negative impact on non-white children. Moving forward, Akin will address the systems that caused this unintended harm. That is quite a statement. Could you elaborate a little more on maybe a little more specifically you guys meant by that, and what the new organization hopes to do specifically to come at that problem?
Sure. So a couple of different things in it. As far as the historical legacies, it is more dramatic on the legacy CHSW side. Both organizations were born out of the progressive era, and CHSW side, we were instrumental in creating the Washington State child protection system. And Child Haven came on a little bit later, also came out of the progressive era, which we all know, historically had lots of positive things for children because it was really part of a child's rights movement and really recognizing children and women as human beings who deserved respect and having rights. So it was certainly well intended and did lots of good things for kids and families. However, we created the family separation system, just like in the rest of the country. And we know, looking back over this past 100 years, that family separation is very harmful for kids and families, and that it has a disproportionate impact on people of color, BIPOC communities. And so, regardless of the good intentions, there was a lot of unintended harm. So going to, what are we hoping to repair as we move forward is one, we really want to see the elimination of family separation in Washington State, in this country. And we really want to partner with families to make sure that they have the resources that they need so that, family separation doesn't become an outcome. And so that's really the reason why we're focusing 100% early intervention, upstream child well-being, family well-being, and supporting caregivers who are taking care of the kids.
Well, I feel like we could spend like an hour just talking about this, and it might not be a very interesting podcast if we did. But I do think people might be interested in hearing, from a CEO perspective, what it is like to work through something like this level of merger. Because you guys are two pretty big organizations and healthy ones, right? Well, that's another interesting, like, Child Haven just merged with somebody else and acquired them. So
Right.
Sometimes you see these and it's like, okay, I know there's some financial need here, and that's okay. That's a good reason to
Right.
merge too. But take us through sort of just the broad strokes, but like from the first time one of you approached each other to finalizing this and announcing it? What went into putting this together?
Sure. So we actually have to go back about 5 years to answer that question a
Wow,
little bit.
5 years.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
about 5 years ago, and John, you probably remember when I got recruited to CHSW. So when I
That's what I was thinking, was like, have
yeah,
you been there for 5 years?
yeah, so I've been here
Yeah.
4.5.
Okay.
And about 5 years ago, John Botten, who was the CEO of Child Haven, when I was being recruited for this position, John approached CHSW and said, "Hey, have you guys thought about the potential of a merger between our organizations?" And the timing was not right for that back then. And so anyway, I as you know, ended up being recruited to CHSW and was hired as its CEO. But not long after I got here, then one of our staff said, "Hey, there's another CEO here in town who approached us about this potential merger, and we weren't ready to do that." And they shared with me his proposal. And so I said, well, I looked at the proposal. I said, well, there's a lot of good stuff in here. And so I got to meet John not long after I came to Seattle, and he and I became friends. And then earlier this year, John announced that he was going to be leaving Child Haven to go into a national consulting role. And so I reached out to John and I said, hey, you remember that proposal that you gave us a couple of years ago or 5 years ago? And I said, do you think that your board would have any interest in exploring this? And he said, well, I don't know. Let me go back. So John went to his board. I went to our board at the time. And we started the conversation really in April of last year. And then we formed a due diligence committee between the two boards. And it resulted in the unanimous decision of both boards in November to do this merger. And so it has been a wild ride, but yeah, the story really began about 5 years ago, John.
What was the most challenging thing to work through? When you got two healthy organizations that are just talking about this, do you remember like the biggest challenge as you guys figured out, like, how can we become one?
I think we're actually from my perspective, at least, I think
Sure.
we're in the most challenging phase actually right now as we're executing the work of weaving the two organizations together. I have to say that both organizations had amazing boards, which, by the way, the board is now 40 members, I think, if I'm counting correctly. So we brought both boards together in this merger. And then we brought going to your point, neither organization was in financial distress. So right now, I have two leadership teams that I'm working with. And John, the former CEO of Child Haven, has also stayed on in a consultative role this year with us. So now we are working to do all the integration work that we need to do here again to build out this newer organization called Akin.
Yeah.
So this is the hard part, John. I think it's going very well. Everybody's leaning into it, but I think this is the hard phase, at least for me.
Yeah, that is a challenge. How do you communicate this to, the fairly large staff at both of these organizations? Like, in particular, I think back to, the statement I read that you kind of elaborated on, really, like, outing complicity, frankly, right, in some of the negative outcomes of child welfare over the years. That's one thing for a couple of CEOs to work out with the writing staff, but I would imagine there's some folks that probably feel a certain way in one direction or the other about that type of statement being attached to like somewhere they've worked for a long time. So how did that go with telling the workforce about this and how they received that in particular?
Well, so one thing, going back to both organizations really being on this trajectory for about 30 years, is that already most of our workforce was already somewhere in that early childhood education, early intervention space already. And so that's one thing about it. And we're all on a journey on this. And John, my own professional history is most of my work as a professional has been in a lot of it affiliated with traditional child protection, child welfare work. And so as we've talked about this, it's really been a journey of how we're all evolving and learning about what works better for kids and families, and really giving ourselves permission to go, there was no ill intentions of this. When I was doing this work 20 years ago, I didn't have any ill intentions of it. I don't believe the majority of people who work in this field have that. But as we learn what works better for kids and families, we have an obligation to evolve in that direction. And so I think people are really seeing it as a process of understanding. And as you know, we look back on the last 10 years of our work across the country, and I think in retrospect, we look at it much differently than we did even 10 years ago.
So Children's Home Society of America, CHSW, as an affiliate, is a pretty important piece of that pie, right? Like your predecessor, Sharon Osborne, was there in Washington for 30 years, I think,
Yes,
maybe even more, was the chair of the National Children's Home Society for quite a long time. Is Akin going to be part of this anymore, or did we just see the end of one of the more important Children's Home Society affiliates?
So the answer is no, that we'll still be very much still involved with CHSA. Okay. And, I would say I'm really continuing the work that Sharon began. Sharon is a visionary leader, and she was really the one who put CHSW on this trajectory of moving into early intervention prevention space. That was actually what attracted me to the opportunity in CHSW. And I'd say, also as you look at sister organizations of CHSW who are also members of CHSA, for example, in Illinois, it's called Brightpoint right now, and I'm friends with Mike Shaver, their CEO, and he has a great article in Forbes magazine, by the way, that just came out. And I would say where Brightpoint is headed is in a very similar direction to where we're headed, and so I think many CHSA members are on a similar trajectory, and here again, it's just a greater awareness of what's going to be better for kids and families.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
So we talked about this very briefly up as we kind of set this all up, but it's been a kind of a couple of years of consequential policymaking there in Washington State. I'm not going to go through all of it, but the ones that seem kind of pertinent to what we're talking about today. Supreme Court, I want to say winter 2022, comes out with this ruling in the Keyon case, which I'll drop a link to our coverage on that, basically saying, the courts must afford meaningful preference to relatives. And then that was quickly followed by, probably smartly, the legislature just codifying it so that it wasn't this court thing hanging out by itself with a little bit more teeth and regulation around it. So how is it from your vantage point at CHS and now at Akin, how have those changes impacted Washington in the short term? And did that in any way, shape the talks around you guys getting together as Akin?
So related to the merger, I don't think it shaped our interest in the merger in any way. One of the things that I like about Washington State is, as you know, no state is perfect, and we have our challenges in Washington, as do all states. But on the whole, Washington State is a progressive state that is really working to reduce the number of kids going into foster care, and then if they do go into foster care, to your point, really meaningfully being connected to whoever they consider to be family, in which we absolutely support. And so I think Washington State is really a good place to test out these ideas and how we can better support kids and families. So I think between the Supreme Court, the legislature, and the governor, I think there's high alignment to creating a better system for kids and families in the state.
I went back and read, I did a little exit interview of sorts with Sharon. And so I asked her, I basically just kind of started as like every generation pretty much, and this is not just specific to child welfare, kind of thinks of like, oh, the new stuff is different than the old in all these different ways. And and that's true in child welfare. I think I was kind of making the point where like everybody thinks like, oh, the kids or the families we're dealing with are much different than they were. And so I asked her if she felt that way in Washington. Her answer was interesting. She said that first off, she had just completed going around the state with you, almost on like a campaign. Do you remember doing that? Right?
Yes, I remember us doing that.
Yeah. So she, and here's her answer. She said, the child brought to us with behavioral problems historically, maybe we get in and find it's related to abuse or neglect or whatever. More now, we're likely to find that there are bigger problems, like that the family has no place to live. About 15 to 20% of the kids in our early childhood programs are homeless. Housing is a major issue. So do you agree with that? And is that continuing? Would you say that is a problem that's worsening in the state? Or what is your answer to that same kind of proposition I put before her?
Here's what I would say, looking back on now through the lens of the pandemic that we all just went through, is that during the pandemic, actually, in so many ways, we saw child and family well-being improve, ironically, during the pandemic, because, and I would just give a big shout out to Chapin Hall and Claire Anderson for their really pivotal work in recognizing what economic supports and other concrete supports for families did during the pandemic. And as we know, it had positive effects, including decreasing child maltreatment across the country. Really, for the first time in my professional career, we did more to support kids and families during the pandemic than at any other time in my career. Now, what we're seeing is, as you know, and your listeners know, all those supports that we put out for kids and families during the pandemic have now either been eliminated or are being phased down. I mean, we are looking at a resurfacing of the child tax credit, which I'm hoping might come back. We'll see. But so now we are seeing kids and families struggling even more than they were before the pandemic. And so, if your life was good before the pandemic, we want to let's go back to what life was like for the pandemic. For millions of kids and families, what life was like before the pandemic, going to Sharon's answer to you, was not good. So a return to normal is bad. And what the pandemic taught us is that funders can be flexible, that we can invest in kids and families, that we can significantly reduce child poverty in the United States. The pandemic proved that we can do all those things, John. But now, as a nation, we're choosing not to do those things again.
Do you feel more locally, even anecdotally, do you sense that they're starting to, the protections that might have alleviated the housing issue specifically during the pandemic and the post-pandemic years, or whatever you want to call it? I know it's still around.
Yeah. To your point, all the protections around housing. Yes. So many working families, and I think that's important for people to remember. A lot of the unhoused are working families. And so
are going away. Are you seeing and hearing about more cases? We're going back to lots of child welfare cases where a huge factor is homelessness. Yes, right. You are hearing that.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, we're seeing families going unhoused. We're seeing food insecurity increase. We are seeing some increases in maltreatment cases. And I would argue that they are more poverty, economic related, rather than there's currently a narrative going on in Washington state around substance use and abuse. And I'm not trying to minimize the impact of that, because we know that that's a critical factor. But I think what we're seeing as far as families going into crisis and kids going into crisis, mental health crisis for kids, we're seeing that nationally and in Washington state. I think this is the aftermath of the pandemic and the withdrawal of support from kids and families.
We talked a lot about Washington. Can I ask you one for a little bit? Your old state, Nebraska?
Oh, geez. Well, we'll see what the question
We'll
is.
keep it. Oh, yeah, because I know you probably will get, ask some legal questions from somebody at some point, right? But so, I didn't mean to be cryptic about this, but Dave, before he went over to lead Children's Home Society of Washington, led an organization called Promise Ship, right? Promise Ship in Nebraska, which folks that don't know, Nebraska is one of the few states where there's kind of full privatization, at least in some places, of child welfare services. Obviously, everybody in the country uses private providers to carry out some services. There's a few states that go kind of above and beyond that and really put almost everything in the hands of private providers, and was the case in Nebraska. And so I had Dave on when we talked about the pandemic a couple of years ago. That was a little too close for us to talk about this, but what happened was Promise Ship was the provider for Nebraska for a while there, put in a bid to continue to be so, and got dramatically underbid by another organization, St. Francis Ministries, who, let's put it this way, it didn't go well. They underbid, and then they didn't have nearly enough money to actually do things. It became a huge crisis in Nebraska because they were about to run out of money and nobody knew where to put kids. They've pretty much been walled off, and the state has, to my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, has really taken over and case management again. And I don't want you to go back to the palace intrigue of it all, or I'm not looking for that. I just it's a couple of years of separation now. You lived through and worked in a system that was fully privatized, and I think that can't be ignored as part of that the story and what happened. And so I'm curious for your thoughts looking back now on, are there lessons from what happened in Nebraska for leaders in other states? If you were going to talk to, the new director of pick your state, mm-hmm. and they were like, "Hey, weren't you involved there? Weren't you around when that whole thing went down in Nebraska? Like, what happened there? Like, what do I need to know? What is that takeaway from everything that happened there?" And I'll drop, by the way, the Omaha papers did a pretty good job of covering this, at least in the aftermath. So I'll drop a link for people that actually want to read more about this. But go ahead.
So a couple things. One, to your point, John, is different states are privatized to different levels.
Yeah.
And I would really argue that privatization is kind of a misnomer, where even in privatized systems, there's a great deal of state control of those systems, which is to some extent, given the role of the child protection system, is appropriate. I would completely reframe Nebraska. In Nebraska is by no means unique in this respect. I would say this is true in almost all the states. Giving your example of Promise Ship being underbid by another organization, one of the problems with the system in this country is our procurement systems are broken. And if the Nebraska procurement system had been functioning properly, and there was a state investigation afterwards that pretty squarely put 100% of the blame on the state agency responsible for that procurement. That doesn't excuse another organization from irresponsibly underbidding a contract, and that CEO is under federal indictment, by the way. But
with his IT guy, I don't even know if that's connected or what, but yeah.
So anyway, that doesn't absolve the other organization for their culpability in that. But if our procurement systems in this country worked properly, providers who provide responsible care for kids and families are the ones who should be selected. And so anyway, segueing, another takeaway for me, and really why I came to Washington State, is regardless of what you call it, privatization or something else, John, I'm at a place, what I've learned through my own lived experience with my kids and the work that I've had in the career, I don't believe the system is reformable. And so part of what attracted me to this opportunity in Washington State is I went to Nebraska hoping to reform that system and was not able to do that. So my takeaway is I'm going to spend my time focusing on child and family well-being and really building something new so that families don't have to be surveilled by the child protection system. So Washington gave me that opportunity, and I'm very humbled that I was given this opportunity. So I want to put all my time and attention on how are we going to keep kids and families together, because the family separation and surveillance system, I don't think can be fixed. And by the way, as you know, I have lots of friends in those systems. So this is not me judging them. This is just me understanding where I think I should invest my time and energy.
Dave Newell, CEO of the newly formed Akin. Dave, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thanks, John.
Thanks to Dave Newell of Akin for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.